She was on her knees scrubbing the grout between the marble tiles when he walked in. It was 8:14 in the morning. The hallway on the 14th floor of the Halverson Capitol building was quiet at that hour, the way office buildings are quiet before the day has properly started, the ventilation system humming somewhere above the drop ceiling, the fluorescent panels washing everything in a faint, cool light. The marble was the kind they put in buildings where money wanted to announce itself without speaking. Off-white with grey veins, very clean except for the grout, which had gone grey at the edges from months of foot traffic and quarterly cleaning schedules that covered the broad strokes but not the seams. Miriam had found the grout brush in the utility closet at the end of the hall. She had not gone looking for it. She had come out of the restroom and seen the brush leaning against the inside of the closet door, which had been left ajar, and her hands had made the decision before she did. She was 43 minutes early for her meeting. The grout was dirty, the brush was there, he had his phone pressed to his ear, moving fast, his shoes striking the floor with the particular confidence of a man who had never once considered who cleaned what he walked on. He didn't stop. He didn't even pause. He just glanced down at her the way you might glance at a mop left in a hallway, registering an obstacle and dismissing it in a single motion, and when he spoke into his phone, he pitched his voice up, nasal and mocking, exaggerating something in the lilt of it, performing it for the person on the other end of the call, and said, "Hold on, I've got to get around the cleaning crew. These people, I swear." He kept walking. He let the door at the end of the hall swing behind him. Miriam set her scrub brush down. She pressed her palm flat against the cold tile and stayed there a moment, very still. She had heard it. Every word. The mimicry too, the pitch of his voice doing what certain voices do when they hear an accent and decide to make it into something comic. The hallway was empty. There was no one to see her face. She picked the brush up and went back to work. That was the part nobody would write about years later. Not the moment itself. What they would write about was everything else. What they would write about was what she had built, what she had given, and what she had never bothered to say out loud or use as a credential or wave in any room where someone might have found it useful to see. What they would write about was how the world eventually catches up to what a person is worth, even when that person never waves her worth in anyone's face. That morning, on her knees in a marble hallway on the 14th floor, Miriam Owusu was just a woman doing her job. She'd been doing her job for a long time. Miriam had come to the United States from Ghana 17 years before that morning, the kind of arrival that begins with a single suitcase and a cousin's couch, and the cold understanding that everything you knew how to do will be undervalued here until you prove otherwise. She had a degree in economics from the University of Ghana. She had worked for 3 years at a development finance institution in Accra, reviewing infrastructure loan portfolios, sitting in meetings where serious people made serious decisions about roads and water systems and whether a bridge in the northern region would be funded through a concessional grant or a commercial loan. She was good at that work. She had been considered, by the people who had supervised her, one of the 2 or 3 sharpest analysts in her cohort. None of that translated at first. Her credentials weren't recognized. Her visa status was complicated. Her English was perfect by any objective measure, but it carried the music of a croix in it, the slight elongation of vowels, the lilt that fell on unexpected syllables. And she had learned quickly that some rooms in this country heard that music and heard something lesser. She had walked into her first job interview for a financial analyst position, a firm that had advertised the position as open to candidates with international credentials, and watched the interviewer's face settle into a kind of polite finality as soon as she spoke. The interview lasted 19 minutes. She was told they would be in touch. They were not in touch, so she cleaned. She cleaned offices downtown while she waited for her paperwork to resolve. She cleaned hotels on the weekend while she took accounting courses at a community college in the evenings. She did not complain about this. There was no one to complain to, and complaining was not, in any case, a habit she had cultivated. She had grown up watching her mother manage a household and a seamstress business simultaneously on a budget that required attention to every seedy, and the discipline she had inherited was not bitterness, but arithmetic. She sent money home every month, $300 at first and then $500, because her mother was sick and there was a younger sister finishing secondary school and a brother who needed fees for the Polytechnic. She budgeted with the precision of someone who had once reviewed municipal debt schedules for a living. She knew exactly how many hours she needed to work to cover rent in the room she shared with 2 other women in a building on the east side of the city, and she worked exactly that many hours. And then she worked more. She was 31 years old and cleaning an office building's executive floor and finishing a course in intermediate financial accounting when a woman named Diane, one of the other cleaners on her shift, asked her what she was always writing in the notebook she kept in her apron pocket. Miriam showed her. Diane looked at the pages, which were full of neat, small, precise notation, and was quiet for a moment and then said, "You're studying accounting?" Miriam said she had a degree in economics but was working toward her CPA. Diane said her brother-in-law ran a small bookkeeping firm and was looking for someone. Did Miriam want his number? The job paid $11 an hour and involved reconciling accounts for 3 small businesses: a dry cleaner, a Caribbean restaurant, and an auto repair shop. Miriam took it. She kept the cleaning job on nights and weekends. She passed her CPA licensing exam on the first attempt, in the top 12% of that sitting. She gave Diane a card from the bakery she liked and said, "Thank you, genuinely, because that was what you did when a person changed the direction of your life." She had her CPA license by the time her youngest cousin graduated high school back in Accra. She had her green card a year after that. She found a position as a junior accountant at a small firm that specialized in non-profit compliance, and she was, from her first month, the kind of employee that firm principals quietly organized their hiring decisions around not losing. She was good at it. She was careful and fast, and she could see problems in a set of books the way some people see patterns in wallpaper. Instantly, without trying, the way her brain had always worked best, with numbers arranged in front of her, and a question waiting to be answered. In 3 years, she was made a senior accountant. In 5, she was a partner. By the time she was 41, Miriam was one of 3 managing partners at Owusu, Breen and Caldwell, a mid-size accounting and financial advisory firm that managed the books and the compliance reporting for 67 clients in 11 states. 11 of those clients were publicly traded companies. 6 were private equity firms with portfolios exceeding $1 billion each. One of those firms was Halverson Capital. Halverson Capital had been a client of her firm for 9 years. She still cleaned, not for hire, not because she had to. She cleaned her own home with the same thoroughness she had brought to those marble floors 2 decades ago, because the habit was in her hands, and she did not see any reason to apologize for it. On Saturday mornings, she put on old clothes and she cleaned, and she thought and she prayed and she was at peace. There was something in the physical work that her brain needed, a kind of movement that freed something up in the part of her mind where the real analysis happened. Some of her best work on difficult accounts had been conceptually resolved on a Saturday morning while her hands were occupied with something simpler. Her children had opinions about this. Her daughter Abena, 22 and studying data science, had offered many times to hire a cleaning service. Her son Marcus, 24 and in his first year at an architecture firm, had offered to come on weekends and help if it was really that important to her, in the slightly puzzled tone of a young man who loved his mother but could not always locate the logic of what she did. Miriam had thanked them both and declined. Her husband David, the civil engineer from Kumasi, whom she had known since they were both 25, had never once offered a word of explanation or intervention on the subject. He made tea on Saturday mornings. He stayed out of the way. Sometimes he sat in the kitchen with his own work spread on the table, and they were in the same quiet space for hours, each doing what they did, and that was 31 years of marriage operating exactly as it was supposed to operate. David was the one who had understood her more than anyone from the beginning. He had found this house. He had looked at 12 houses in 3 weeks, a methodical survey, and brought her to this one on a Saturday afternoon, and watched her walk the rooms, and she had walked the long hallway and stopped and pressed her hand to the hardwood, which was old and warm, and had been there since the house was built in 1962, and he had watched her face and known. They bought it 2 months later. What Miriam did not know that spring morning when the man in the well-cut suit walked past her in the hallway was that she had been on the 14th floor of the Halverson Capital building for a very specific reason. One of the firm's junior portfolio companies, a logistics startup called Centra Dispatch, had moved its offices into a sublease on floors 12 through 15. Miriam had come in early before her official 9 o'clock meeting in the building's main conference suite, and when she arrived 40 minutes ahead of schedule, she had asked the lobby attendant if there was a restroom on the executive floors. The attendant had sent her to 14. That was why she had been on her knees in the hallway. Not because she worked there, because she had arrived early and a restroom faucet was dripping, and she found a grout brush in the utility closet in the hallway, and she couldn't help herself. 17 years of habit do not let go in the presence of dirty grout and a spare brush. She cleaned because it was clean now, and she had the brush in her hand. She was not cleaning because of who she was. She was cleaning because of what she had always been. And the man walking past her, the one with the phone and the mocking voice, did not know any of that. His name was Jeffrey Parr. He was 46 years old and had been the chief executive officer of Centra Dispatch for 3 years, brought in by Halverson Capital to professionalize the company's operations ahead of a Series C raise. He was the kind of executive who understood certain languages fluently: investor decks, cap tables, headcount optimization, cost per acquisition. He understood those things with a quick and confident fluency, and he had been rewarded for that fluency his entire career. Other languages, including the language of who a person actually was beneath their uniform or their accent or their position in a room, he had not spent much time studying. He had not needed to. The rooms he moved through had rarely required it. Jeffrey was not, in his own mind, a cruel man. He was efficient. He was direct. He had little patience for what he called friction, and people who moved slowly or spoke differently or occupied his peripheral vision without apparent productivity were, in his framework, friction. He did not think about her again after he rounded the corner toward the elevator bank. He had a 9 o'clock meeting to get to. He had an investor he needed to impress. He did not know that the investor he needed to impress was the woman he had just called these people in a marble hallway. He did not know that Miriam's firm had been managing Halverson Capital's portfolio compliance for 9 years, or that Miriam personally oversaw the quarterly reviews for every portfolio company in the fund's third vehicle, which included Centra Dispatch. He did not know that she had spent the last 11 days reading Centra Dispatch's books. He did not know what she had found. He did not know that she had scheduled this morning's meeting specifically because of what she had found. He did not know any of it. He took the elevator to the lobby and crossed the street for a coffee and felt satisfied with the shape of his morning. Miriam put the grout brush back in the utility closet. She washed her hands in the restroom. She looked at herself in the mirror for a moment, the kind of look that is not about vanity but about settling. She straightened her blazer, which was charcoal grey and well cut, a thing she had bought 3 years ago when a particular meeting had called for it, and had been wearing to significant meetings since. She picked up her briefcase from where she had left it, just inside the restroom door. She took the elevator to the main conference suite on the 2nd floor. Her heels were quiet on the carpet. The building was filling now, people moving through the lobby downstairs, the sound of it reaching her as a kind of low, ambient hum. Halverson Capital's managing director, Robert Ansin, was already seated with 2 members of his investment team when she entered. Robert was 61, a meticulous man with the particular composure of someone who had been managing other people's money long enough to have learned that composure was its own form of discipline. He had been working with Miriam's firm for 4 of the 9 years of their client relationship, and he trusted her the way you trust someone whose work you have watched over time. Not because of a single thing they said, but because of the consistent quality of everything they produced. "Miriam," Robert said, standing. "Good morning. We've got Jeffrey joining us in a few minutes." "I know," she said. She set her briefcase on the table. If you're wondering whether Miriam knew what was about to happen, the answer is that she knew exactly. She had known for 11 days. She had spent those 11 days being careful and precise and thorough, because careful and precise and thorough were the only modes in which she operated, and because what she had found in Centra Dispatch's accounts required care. It was not the kind of thing you brought to a meeting with accusations. It was the kind of thing you brought with documentation. She had confirmed the delivery records against the contract language 3 times. She had called the general counsel of one of the enterprise clients, a logistics company in the southeast, and asked 2 specific questions about the service completion timeline, and the answers had told her what she needed to know. She had written the report herself, every line, over 4 evenings at her desk at home, after David and the children were asleep, because there are reports you delegate and reports you do not, and this was the second kind. She had the documentation. Jeffrey walked into the conference suite at 2 minutes after 9. He was wearing the same suit he had been wearing in the hallway. He scanned the room quickly with the particular scan of a man who was assessing status, and his eyes moved from Robert to the 2 associates, and then to Miriam. And for one moment, something crossed his face. A flicker. Not recognition, more like the slightly uncomfortable sensation of a category mismatch. The way your brain stutters when it places something in the wrong frame and has to adjust. She had seen that flicker before in other conference rooms with other executives. She knew what it was. It was the half-second recalibration of a person who had arrived expecting the room to have a certain shape and found it differently arranged. She did not react to it. She never did. He recovered quickly. He smiled the broad, confident smile of a man presenting to investors and extended his hand across the table. "Jeffrey Parr," he said. "Pleasure." "Miriam Owusu," she said. "Owusu, Breen and Caldwell." He nodded once. His smile stayed in place. He sat down across from her and laid his own folder on the table, and she could see him already settling into his presentation posture. The squared shoulders, the forward lean, the readiness to perform for the room. Robert spoke first. "Miriam has completed the Q1 portfolio compliance review for the Fund 3 companies," he said. "We're here this morning to go through her findings on Centra Dispatch before we proceed with the Series C timeline." Jeffrey's posture shifted, almost imperceptibly, just a slight adjustment. Not alarm. Not yet. More like a recalibration of a different kind, the movement of a man who had come in planning to speak and has just learned he will be listening first. "Of course," he said, happy to address any questions. Miriam opened her briefcase. She placed a bound report on the table, 12 pages, and she slid copies to Jeffrey and to each person present. She did not perform this. She was matter-of-fact about it, the same way she was matter-of-fact about everything that required precision. She had been matter-of-fact about difficult findings in front of executives many times in her career, and she had learned that the clearest possible presentation of facts was both the kindest and the most effective approach. You did not need to wave a fact in someone's face. You placed it in front of them, clearly labelled, and let them look. "I want to begin with the revenue recognition schedule," she said, "specifically the Q3 and Q4 enterprise contracts." What she had found was this. Centra Dispatch had been recognizing revenue from 2 enterprise contracts as fully delivered in periods when the services had not, in fact, been fully delivered. The accounting was not sloppy, it was selective. The decisions had been made at the executive level, documented in board memos that used careful language, and they had the effect of making Q3 and Q4 numbers look significantly stronger than they were. The company's ARR, as reported to Halverson Capital, was overstated by roughly $2.3 million. The Series C raise was built substantially on those numbers. She walked through it methodically. She cited the contracts, she cited the delivery records. She showed the recognition dates against the actual service completion dates. She cited the board memos, including the ones that Jeffrey had signed. She did not editorialize, she did not raise her voice. She did not look at Jeffrey except when she was addressing a question directly to him, and when she did, her expression was the same as it always was, calm and patient and specific. Jeffrey's face had gone through several phases by the time she reached page 9. She had seen this before. There was the initial confidence, the challenge implicit in his early questions, the brief attempt to reframe the accounting as a legitimate interpretation. Then, somewhere around page 6, when the delivery records were laid against the recognition dates side by side and the gap became numerically unavoidable, something else arrived. A kind of stilled quality. A man arriving at the edge of something he could not talk his way past. "These contracts," he said. "There's an argument for percentage of completion accounting here that your report doesn't address." "I address it on page 10, Miriam said quietly. "The percentage of completion method would require contemporaneous documentation of completion milestones. That documentation doesn't exist for these contracts. What exists is the delivery confirmation, which is dated after your recognition date in both cases." Robert Anson had said very little for the last 40 minutes. He was a careful man, and a thorough one, and he had been reading as Miriam talked, and the silence from his side of the table was a particular kind of silence. The 2 associates were not taking notes anymore. They were watching Jeffrey. "I want to understand the board memo on page 8, Robert said finally. His voice was even. "This one, where it says the executive team authorized accelerated recognition in anticipation of delivery. Who is the executive team referenced here?" Jeffrey straightened. He didn't answer immediately. "That would be myself and the CFO," he said. The room held that for a moment. Miriam turned to the final section of her report. My recommendation to Halverson Capital, she said, is to pause the Series C process pending a restatement of Q3 and Q4 revenue, an independent audit of the recognition schedule for all enterprise contracts in the prior 24 months, and a review of the executive authorization process for non-standard accounting treatments. She closed the report. Those are my findings. I'm happy to answer any questions. Jeffrey looked at her across the table. He looked at her for a long time, and then something happened in his face that Miriam had seen before in other rooms when a person finally registered what they were seeing. Not who she was specifically, more fundamental than that. The understanding that the woman across the table had done all of this, had read every line and found every gap and built every page of that report, and that she had been sitting in this room the whole time, and that he had been the one who hadn't been paying attention. He did not say anything. There was nothing, at that point, that served him to say. The meeting ended 40 minutes later. Robert walked Miriam to the elevator. He was quiet for a moment, and then he said, "How long have you known?" 11 days, she said. He nodded slowly. "I appreciate the care you took with this." "It is what you pay us to do," she said simply. And then, because she was not a person who left important things unsaid to the people who deserve to hear them. "Your capital is safe, Robert. The contracts can be restated. The underlying business has real operating metrics. This is recoverable." He looked at her with the expression of a man who had just realized exactly how much he had been relying on, exactly the right person, without quite knowing it. "Thank you, Miriam," he said. She pressed the button for the lobby. "Thank you for trusting us with it. If you have ever wondered what it looks like when the world corrects itself, it does not always look like a dramatic confrontation. Sometimes it looks like a 12-page report delivered in a measured voice in a conference room, while a man in a good suit slowly understands the shape of his situation. Sometimes the correction is quiet. Sometimes the most complete kind of justice is the kind that arrives without flourish, simply as the plain consequence of one person having done their work with complete honesty and care, while another person did not. Miriam did not see Jeffrey again that day. She walked out of the building at 10:47 and stood on the sidewalk for a moment in the spring air, which smelled of the city and of something green trying to happen in the concrete median strip across the street. She did not feel triumphant. She never did, after meetings like this. What she felt was the quiet, tired satisfaction of work done correctly. The same feeling she got on Saturday mornings when the floor was clean. The thing had needed to be done, and she had done it. The numbers were right now. They would go into a file, and the file would go where it needed to go, and the company would either correct its course or it would not. And that was not her decision to make. Her decision had been the 11 days. Her decision had been the 12 pages. That part was finished. She caught the bus back to the office. She had 2 other client files waiting on her desk and an afternoon call with a firm in Ohio and a stack of quarterly disclosures to review. And she thought about those things on the bus, watching the city go past the windows, already somewhere else in her mind. He resigned from Centra Dispatch 6 weeks later, before the audit was complete, before the restatement was filed, before Halverson Capital had finished its internal review. The press release used the phrase "pursue other opportunities," which is the language companies use when a departure was not chosen, and both parties understand that. The CFO, who had co-signed the authorization memos, left 2 weeks after Jeffrey did. There was no public statement about either of them. There rarely was. The independent audit confirmed every line of Miriam's report, including a 3rd enterprise contract that her initial review had flagged for follow-up and that the auditors were able to examine with full access. The overstatement was closer to $2.7 million than the $2.3 her report had estimated, which was not unusual. When you find something like this, there is almost always a little more. The Series C was restructured after a clean restatement, and Centra Dispatch eventually closed the round a year later, smaller and more honest and on a sounder footing. The new CEO, a woman named Petra, who had been the COO of a competing logistics firm, called Miriam the first week to introduce herself and ask if Owusu, Breen and Caldwell would stay on as the company's compliance firm under the new structure. She was direct and prepared, and she asked specific questions, and Miriam answered them with the same care she brought to every conversation. And by the end of the call, she could tell that Petra had already reviewed the company's prior compliance work and understood exactly what had happened. Miriam said, yes. Of course she said yes. That was also her job. She did not think much about the hallway after a while. She had spent 17 years not thinking much about hallways. The accumulation of small dismissals over the course of a life is something that each person manages in their own way. And Miriam's way was to note them, briefly and without drama, and then go back to work. The work was always more interesting than the dismissal. The work was where she lived. Have you ever known someone like Miriam? The kind of person who just keeps doing the thing, keeps showing up and doing it right and doing it completely, whether or not the room is paying attention. If you have, leave a word in the comments. There is something about watching that kind of person be finally, completely seen. The rest of this story is exactly that. There is a thing that happens over the course of a long career built with that kind of steadiness that is difficult to describe unless you have witnessed it from close enough. The work accumulates. Not in a way that anyone announces, in a way that simply grows the way a tree grows, incrementally and without fanfare, until one day someone notices how large it has become and understands that it has been growing all along. People who worked alongside Miriam in the early years of the firm often said, when asked later, that they had not fully understood what they were watching at the time. They had understood she was good. They had not understood the scale of what good meant for someone who never stopped. By the time she was 45, Miriam had served as lead compliance advisor to 43 portfolio companies across 4 private equity funds. She had sat on 2 audit committees as an independent member. She had testified before a state financial oversight board twice in both cases, called specifically because of the clarity and completeness of her documentation. She had been invited to speak at a national accounting conference in Atlanta, where she delivered a 40-minute lecture on revenue recognition integrity in growth stage companies that was, according to the conference coordinator, the most downloaded session recording in the conference's 6-year history. She had sent the coordinator a brief thank you note afterward, as she did after every engagement that reflected well on the firm, because that was also simply what you did. She had also hired 12 people. This was the part she was most proud of. Not the testimony, not the conference, not the clients with the 9-figure portfolios. 12 people over 8 years, most of them first-generation immigrants, most of them with credentials that had been dismissed or deferred or simply not recognized when they arrived in this country. She had found them the way she had found herself, through community college placement offices and accounting programs at state universities and professional associations that kept directories of young practitioners who were looking for firms that would actually see them. One of them was a woman from Senegal who had a master's degree in financial management from a university in Dakar and had been working as a hotel front desk clerk for 4 years because no accounting firm would return her calls. Miriam had met her at a community networking event, asked her 3 questions about a hypothetical balance sheet problem, and called her the next morning with an offer. Another was a man from El Salvador who had been a municipal auditor in San Salvador for 9 years and had spent his first 2 years in this country doing data entry at an insurance company. He was now a senior accountant overseeing 3 of the firm's largest non-profit clients. She paid for 2 of them to sit for their CPA exams when the exam fees were a financial hardship. She mentored 4 of them through the licensing process personally, which meant phone calls on Sunday afternoons and study guides annotated in her own hand, and, once, a 2-hour meeting at a coffee shop on a Thursday evening because someone was about to fail a critical section and needed to be talked back from the edge of giving up. 3 of them were now partners at other firms. 2 of them were still at Owusu, Breen and Caldwell, building the thing alongside her. David liked to say that the real balance sheet of her career was the people column, not the revenue column. He was right, he usually was. That was one of the better things about 31 years of marriage to a careful man who paid attention. That Saturday, a few weeks after the Centra Dispatch meeting closed out, Miriam woke at 6 and cleaned. She moved through the kitchen first, then the bathrooms, then the long hallway of the house she and David had bought 12 years ago in a quiet neighborhood 3 miles from the office. The hallway had no marble tiles. It had hardwood, old and warm-toned, the kind that had been there since the house was built in 1962. She cleaned it the same way she cleaned everything. Completely and without hurry, down on one knee with a cloth and a bucket of water that smelled like cedar. Her youngest daughter came downstairs at 7:30 in pyjamas and bare feet and stood in the kitchen doorway watching her. "Mom," she said, with the particular exasperation of a 22-year-old confronting a parent's inexplicable Saturday habit, "you know we could hire someone." "I know," Miriam said. She did not look up from the floor. "So, why don't you?" Miriam sat back on her heels and considered this, the way she considered things she had been asked before but was willing to answer freshly each time. "Because it's my floor," she said finally. "Because I know every inch of it. Because when I'm done, I know exactly what I've done." Her daughter looked at her for a long moment with the expression of someone who understood the words and was still working out their full weight. Then she went and got a second cloth from under the sink and knelt down beside her mother and started cleaning the baseboards. Miriam looked at her daughter's hands, young and careful, moving along the wood. She did not say anything. She did not need to. Some things pass without a word in the quiet of an ordinary Saturday morning between a woman and the daughter who has been watching her all her life. That was the ledger that mattered. Not the revenue recognition reports, not the audit confirmations, not the partnership agreements filed with the state, not even the 12 people whose careers had found their footing because one woman had thought to look. The ledger that mattered was a daughter on her knees cleaning a baseboard because it was the right thing to do, and she had watched her mother do right things her whole life. The hardwood gleamed when they were done. Miriam stood and put her hands on her lower back and stretched, the way she always did when she had been down on the floor for a while, and she looked at the length of the hall, clean and warm in the early morning light coming through the window at the end. Her phone buzzed on the kitchen counter. A message from Robert Ansin. The restructured Centra Dispatch Series C had closed. He was thanking her. He was saying that the lead investor, going over the clean restatement in detail, had specifically cited the clarity of the compliance documentation as a reason for confidence in the company's new governance posture. He was saying, in the restrained language of a careful private equity executive, that her work had made this possible. She read it once. She set the phone back down. She went to the kitchen and put a kettle on and got 2 mugs from the cabinet and called to her daughter that the tea was almost ready. Outside, the morning had gone fully bright, the kind of clear spring morning that arrives without warning and makes the whole street look like something that had been waiting a long time for light. The window above the kitchen sink framed a square of sky that was nearly cloudless, the colour you get for maybe an hour before the day fills in with its ordinary haze. Miriam poured the tea. She carried both mugs to the table and sat down across from her daughter, and the two of them sat in the light for a while, not talking much, the way people do when they are comfortable with each other and the house is clean, and the morning is asking nothing of them yet. If you had walked past the window and looked in at that moment, you would have seen 2 women at a kitchen table with cups of tea and the light coming in. You would not have seen a managing partner. You would not have seen the compliance reports or the board memo or the 9 years of careful work that had built to a 12-page document delivered in a conference room to a man who had, for a moment, looked at her and seen a cleaning lady. You would not have seen any of that. You would have seen what was actually there, which was a woman at home, at rest, at the table she had worked for, in the house she had earned, with her daughter beside her, and the morning stretched out ahead and not one thing left to prove. That is the part of the story that doesn't usually get told. Not the revelation in the conference room, not the executive who had to figure out how badly he had misjudged the room. Those things matter, and they happened, and they were their own kind of necessary reckoning. The revelation had arrived, as it always does, not through spectacle, but through the plain accumulation of a person's life made visible. Through documentation. Through precision. Through 17 years of showing up and doing the work completely and without apology. The part that usually does not get told is the after. The after is a daughter who comes downstairs in pyjamas and picks up a cloth. The after is a cup of tea in the morning. The after is 31 years of a man who paid attention. The after is 12 people whose careers have footing because you thought to look. The after is the work still, but different, quieter. The proof already in and the verdict already in, and the morning, just the morning. Miriam wrapped her hands around her mug. The tea was strong and warm and tasted faintly of ginger, the way she had made it since she was a girl in Accra. Her daughter was telling her something about a project she was working on, something about data and analysis, and Miriam was listening the way she always listened, completely and without hurry. Outside the light held, the floor behind her was clean. Was there ever a moment that proved itself without any announcement, something that just arrived and settled and was enough? Share it below if there was. And if you want another story about a person whose worth the world eventually had to reckon with, there's one waiting right after this. This is a work of fiction. All characters, events, and organizations depicted are entirely imaginary and created for storytelling purposes.